Hi, so my name is Holly Baker. Welcome to my video. My project doesn't exactly have a title yet, but it centres around the concepts of affect theory and reconciliation. Essentially, I'm aiming to explore the current affective climate of reconciliation in the wake of the 2008 apology to the stolen generations, and the role that affect theory might come to play in a continuing process of reconciliation. So I'm going to break my video down into a few sections today just to make it a little bit easier. In section 1, I'll be outlining exactly what affect theory is and giving you a little bit of history. In section 2, I'll be discussing some more contemporary notions of affect, explaining where my research will fit in with the literature, and very briefly explaining my own affective experience that sparked my interest in this project. And in section 3, I'll be looking at the variety of ways that we can conceptualise reconciliation and the role that affect theory might come to play in this process. So let's get started. Just to be clear, we're talking about affect people, not effect. Let's get started. Okay. So firstly, there are a multitude of ways of conceptualising affect and a number of schools of thought. But for the sake of brevity and cohesion, I will be focusing almost exclusively on the work of Sylvan Tompkins and Donald Nathanson, whose school of thought my research follows. So really simplistically, an affect can be described as an innate force, or as Donald Nathanson explains, affect is the strictly biological portion of emotion. So Nathanson goes on to say that affects are essentially the engines that drive us. What he means here is that affects are productive in nature and they can be responsible for a wide range of reactions to environmental stimuli, such as quickening of our heartbeat, sweating, blushing, hiding our face away from the world. But before we get too heavy into the theory side of affect, I thought I would show you a short video that essentially allows you to meet some affects. Enjoy.
Ever wonder why you feel the way you do? Well, get to know your emotions. When everything in your life is going your way, that's when joy takes control. This is joy. With an unstoppable spirit and unbeatable energy, joy brings a smile to your face and who cares? Let's party! This is Disgust. Whether advising on your social life or on life's little messes, Disgust is there to, well, hold on. When the unexpected is staring you in the face, fear is there to keep you safe. With speed and wisdom, fear assesses the situation and settles your nerves in his own special way. He's got this. Thank you, fear. When things go wrong, anger is there. This is anger. He will make sure the world knows anger is in control. But what you really need to watch out for is when he's out of control.
So I realised that within those clips they actually refer to those characters as emotions, but they're all in fact affects, as delineated by Tompkins. Whilst I believe that this conflation between affects and emotions was probably just done to make the subject matter a little bit more accessible, fortunately for me it's also symbolic of the way the terms are frequently used interchangeably. However, by examining the work of countless affect theorists such as Angel and Gibbs, Deleuze and Guattari, Brian Masumi and Tompkins and Nathanson as well, we're shown that they're actually quite different but interlinked concepts. But first, a little bit of history. So as affect theories span a variety of discourses, there's a myriad of ways of exploring its inception. Some philosophers, such as Lou Augusta, suggest that there are elements of affect theory in the rhetoric of Aristotle, and going as far back as Heidegger and his exploration of a being in the world in the 1920s. However, these explorations merely reiterate the need for a clearer terminology around affect theory. As many of the early texts discuss pathos, emotions, passions and feelings interchangeably. It's not really until the work of Sylvan Tompkins in the 1950s and 60s that we start getting a really clear picture of affect and its separation from emotion. So Sylvan Tompkins is known as the father of affect theory. He was the first to delineate the system of 9 discrete affects, 7 pairs and 2 singular, some of which we saw before in the video, and here are some of the others. So here are Tompkins' 9 affects, 7 pairs and 2 singular. They are enjoyment/joy, interest/excitement, surprise/startle, shame/humiliation, distress/anguish, disgust, which is singular, fear/terror, anger/rage, and dismay, which is also singular. And it must be noted that the latter of these pairings is the stronger version of the affect. So Tompkins was really the first to discuss and define the difference between affects and emotions within the first two volumes of his really well-renowned trilogy, Affect, Imagery and Consciousness. So affects for Tompkins are born of Darwinian natural selective processes and thus are innate, meaning, as Nathanson points out, that essentially everyone has pretty much the same built-in affect mechanisms, but how these affects manifest themselves brings us closer to the distinction between affects and emotions. So the distinction for Tompkins lies in the fact that emotions are more complex social and cultural elaborations of affect. Things like melancholy, nostalgia, homesickness, and a schadenfreude. P.S. If you want a really good explanation of schadenfreude, you can't go past The Simpsons. It's actually Nathanson, though, that has a really good simple quote that always helps me to remember the difference between emotions and affects, and that is that affect is biology and emotion is biography. What Nathanson means by this is that emotions have an element of cultural construction and personal biography about them. Basically, that our emotional reaction to stimuli is heavily influenced by similar situations we may have encountered in the past, where we have formed particular scripts or familiar coping mechanisms, unlike our affective reactions, which are innate and pretty much universally comparable. Another lens that we can use to think about affect theory is that of phenomenology and the work of Merleau-Ponty in particular. He explores the notion of subjectivity and the role of the body in our understanding of the world, or how we both are and have a body. This notion of subjectivity is heavily tied to affect, which Seaworth and Gregg delineate as potentiality, a body's capacity to affect and be affected. This sense of duality, when coupled with a focus on the multiplicity of affects within the body, all growing together, blending into one another, sticking to some, imbibing certain objects, essentially brings us closer to more contemporary notions of affect, which I will touch on in video 2. So affect, according to Seaworth and Gregg, exists in a state of what they call in-betweenness, in liminality, as visceral forces or intensities that circulate around, through, within, and sometimes stick to certain bodies. This happens, they say, on a level of unconscious knowing, which can spur us to act or just as easily arrest us. What this reiterates is that affect is productive in nature. Whilst it can be born of exogenous stimuli, it will always produce a corporeal reaction. This is exemplified in the blush, which can be seen as a physiological marker of shame and a force that unabashedly reveals our invested interest in the world and people around us. It's now that I'd like to narrow my focus a little bit and direct our discussion to shame specifically, as I believe that it will figure prominently within my work. So there is, for Elspeth Probyn, a really strong and intimate connection between shame and interest. And what she means by this is that we only experience moments of shame if it's preceded by a moment of interest. In the simplest terms, you only feel shame if you're interested in those who are your real or imagined witnesses. For example, I felt a certain amount of shame whilst I was writing this transcript and recording this video, as all of you hold my interest. I care what you think. Another important aspect of shame is that it requires this witness, as we just explored. So the act of shame can have a real witness, such as when you might have to give a speech to a marker, and you obviously care about the mark that they're going to be giving you and what they think about you. Or this witness can be imagined, such as I've imagined all of your reactions to this very video and felt real pangs of shame. So I guess this brings me to my own affective experience within the process of reconciliation, which has a lot to do with shame. So I remember marching across the Harbour Bridge on May 28, 2000 as part of the Walk for Reconciliation movement. I don't necessarily remember details like the date or time, but I have a very clear moment of affective resonance, you could say. One that I didn't really understand or have the language to articulate until I found affect theory.
I was only 12 when I attended this, and whilst I come from quite a politically minded family, this is the largest scale event I'd ever been part of. My major interaction with Indigenous Australians, like a lot of white Australians my age, I think, was through the process of reconciliation. And I think whatever I had garnered from these interactions had begun to manifest itself as white guilt. So the day of the march, I distinctly remember a heavy feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unease. In the lead up to the bridge, like the train ride and the walk from the station, I could feel this unease manifesting itself in strange ways, such as worrying about my clothing choices, wondering whether they could tell that we were on our way to the march. It wasn't really until I got to the actual march, though, and started to be engulfed by the crowd that I realised how much they held my interest. I realised it came from a place of fear that everyone there would be Aboriginal and that I, being white, did not belong there. I wanted them to know this, that I knew I didn't belong there. I think this feeling obviously came from a place of white guilt and shame. Shame not only of being white in that situation, but for all I believed whites have done to our Indigenous population. This was the first time I had ever really felt white. And whilst I'm sure I had experienced collective white shame before, this is the first time I had felt it on an individual level.
So what I'd hoped that my experience in particular highlighted for you is the existence of white privilege and guilt, and how within the process of reconciliation this can leave people in an unproductive space of shame, numbness or denial, in some cases all three. Anthony Moran expands on this, stating that there also exists a level of fear around reconciliation, in that an acknowledgement of past atrocities might cause those memories and their emotions to flood into the present and ruin it. He also states that this fear and shame can spill over into other emotions, like a sense of national melancholia, resulting from the belief that we as a nation are irredeemably bad. This sense of national melancholia is an interesting one and got me thinking about the role of nationalism in reconciliation. This could provide a further affective dimension for my work, maybe looking into the concept of Australia's national imaginary identity as a happy object. Sarah Ahmed posits that objects are capable of imbibing or accruing certain affective value, and if we look at what it means to be Australian, in this sense, it might help us to understand how some people see the rhetoric of reconciliation and inclusivist policies as threatening. So I'd now like to briefly explore a case study of the Sorry Books campaign. It happened in 1998, and it's mostly within the work of a lady called Roseanne Kennedy. So this campaign was organised by a group called ANT, Australians for Native Title. They designed and distributed over 1,000 Sorry books at various places like the Body Shop, schools, libraries, community centres, universities. These books only had one page of writing in them and the rest were blank. The one page explained that the purpose of such a book was to record their signatures as support for Indigenous Australians in light of the injustices perpetrated against them, and to record their desires for reconciliation and a better tomorrow for all Australians. So these books circulated widely and for the most part were filled with messages of regret, apology and hope for the future. Some groups even went so far as to make their own sorry books when they could not gain access to the official ones. Kennedy argues that these books provided a safe affective space that promoted affective agency and essentially gave Australians the opportunity to reaffirm our humanity, which was important given the claims that white Australians failed to show any compassion or concern for Indigenous people in the past. So this agency was heightened through the making and decorating of their own books. Kennedy also argues that these books provided a non-confrontational space and a mode of engagement that instilled in Australians a moral obligation to respond, and further taught them how to respond in ways that were deemed culturally appropriate. So even on a surface level, by now I'm hoping that you can start to see why an affective understanding of the process of reconciliation is really important. It's such an emotionally charged issue, one that encompasses elements of fear, what we love, what we are ashamed of, and who we are. The main role of affect, though, I believe, will be to provide these spaces to provide spaces, with which to unpack and explore the process of reconciliation, and to create a space in which our guilt is approached not with fear of impending doom, but with a spirit of repatriation. So I just want to end this with this last thought from John Cash, who makes an interesting connection between affect and reconciliation. Cash defines the process of reconciliation as palpably about subjectivity and intersubjectivity, about how individuals and collectives think and feel about their present and past relationships with other subjects and collectives. Affect is heavily tied to the notion of subjectivity, which, as Siegwerth and Gregg, who we spoke about earlier, delineate as potentiality, a body's capacity to affect and be affected. Therefore, for Cash, the link between affect and reconciliation is no real link at all. The process of reconciliation itself will take place within the realm of affectivity. So just to wrap up, I have a few slides which reiterate the main points and hopefully help to bring it all together for you. Thank you.
So here is a bit of an overview. For Tompkins, affects are innate forces that can compel us to act or just as easily arrest us. Whilst the triggers can come from the outside, like the environment, affects will always produce a corporeal reaction. For Nathanson, we need to remember that affects are biological, whilst emotions are biographical. He reminds us that our emotions are based on our previous encounters, whilst affects are innate and pretty much universal. For Probyn, it's her exploration of shame, highlighting the intimate relationship between shame and interest, and the role of the real or imagined witness. Exploring shame is particularly relevant for me in my discussion of reconciliation. It's particularly important as it will allow us to understand the concepts of white guilt, which can lead to unproductive spaces around reconciliation. So this is ultimately what I hope to do, to try and understand the different ways reconciliation is conceptualized, to use affect theory to attempt to understand the relationship between nationalism and reconciliation, possibly employing the work of Sarah Ahmed and her concept of happy objects, to use affect theory to try and unpack white guilt and shame, as I suspect they foster an unproductive space that creates a sense of numbness and denial, and to try and theorize a way forward for reconciliation and how affect theory might help to create spaces that foster affective agency. Thanks for listening, guys.
Marker and action.
Oh. Okay.
A little help here, please. What are we gonna do, Buzz?
Use your head.
But I don't want to use my head! Ow! Speed. Marker. Okay, and pull back.
Whew! I don't remember eating that.
Cut.
I can't believe this.
That's the fifth
What
time.
row is that guy in? Sorry, everyone. I had that bean burrito for lunch. Okay, I'm all right now. Sorry.
Now, bye-bye. Bye. Okay. Are they all gone? Is everybody gone?